Picture this, you're sitting at your computer, and there it is, a sticky note with your wife's password, carelessly left behind like a breadcrumb trail to betrayal. My finger hovered over the keyboard for what felt like an eternity. I knew that once I typed those letters, once I pressed enter, there would be no going back. What I discovered didn't just destroy my marriage, it obliterated another man's entire existence. And honestly, he deserved every second of it. If you've ever felt that burning desire for justice when someone crosses the line, you're going to love this story. Hit that subscribe button because we're diving into a tale of calculated revenge that was so perfectly executed, it left one cheating husband unemployed, homeless, and running from state to state. Like this video if you believe in consequences, and let's witness how one man's infidelity became his complete downfall. Let me take you back to the early 2000s, a time when AOL was still king, flip phones were cutting-edge technology, and social media hadn't yet turned everyone's private life into public entertainment. I was living what I thought was the American dream, married to my college sweetheart, 2 beautiful kids aged 4 and 6, a decent job, and a house in the suburbs. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was content. But contentment has a way of making you complacent, doesn't it? You stop noticing the small changes, the subtle shifts in routine that should set off alarm bells. At first, it was just little things. My wife seemed distracted, always checking her phone, and there was this distance between us that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then the kids started talking. You know how children are, innocent, honest to a fault, and completely unaware when they're dropping bombshells. My 6-year-old daughter came home one afternoon, chattering excitedly about spending time with Grandma and Grandpa. Nothing unusual there, grandparents love spoiling their grandchildren. But then she mentioned it again the next day. And the day after that. We went to Grandma's house again today, Daddy. We played in the backyard while Mommy was gone. Gone? Gone where? I started paying closer attention to these seemingly innocent conversations. My 4-year-old son would casually mention how they'd spend most of the day at his grandparents' house, how Mommy would disappear for a while and come back later to pick them up. The more they talked, the more the pieces started forming a picture I really didn't want to see. Now, let me paint you a picture of the logistics here. My wife's parents lived about 90 minutes away, that's a 3-hour round trip, minimum. Doing this once a week? Understandable. Maybe even twice a week if there was some family event or emergency. But my kids were talking about being there too, sometimes 3 times a week. That's basically every day my wife wasn't working her part-time job. The math didn't add up, and when math doesn't add up in a marriage, there's usually a reason that has nothing to do with arithmetic. I tried the direct approach first, you know, that crazy concept called communication that marriage counselors are always preaching about. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I casually brought it up. The kids seem to be spending a lot of time with your parents lately. Her response was immediate, too immediate. Oh, you know how Mom is. She loves having them around, especially now that she's retired. And it gives me a chance to run errands without dragging them everywhere. Plausible. Reasonable. Completely believable if you wanted to believe it. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite guilt, wasn't quite fear, but definitely wasn't truth. My wife had many talents, but lying wasn't one of them. She'd get this tell, her voice would get slightly higher, and she'd avoid eye contact just a split second too long. I pressed a little further. That's a lot of driving, though. Nearly 3 hours round trip several times a week. It's not that bad, she said, already turning away, already ending the conversation. Besides, the kids love it there. That night, lying in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling and felt something cold settle in my stomach. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was certainty. Something was happening, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, after she left for work, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I checked the odometer on her car. Call it paranoia, call it intuition, but I wrote down that number and tucked it away in my wallet. For the next few weeks, I became a man obsessed with mathematics. Every few days, I'd check that odometer, doing quick calculations in my head. Her work was 12 miles from home. The grocery store, the bank, the kids' school, I knew the distance to all the regular places she'd need to go. And what I discovered made my blood run cold. She was driving an extra 400 miles per week. 400 miles that couldn't be accounted for by any legitimate activity I could think of. 400 miles per week of lies. The worst part wasn't the deception, it was the normalcy of everything else. She still kissed me goodbye in the morning, still asked about my day when I came home, still helped the kids with their homework. We were living this perfectly choreographed life, and I was the only one who didn't know it was all an act. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I'd catch myself staring at her during dinner, wondering where those 400 miles were taking her. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and study her sleeping face, trying to reconcile the woman I married with the stranger who was systematically lying to me every single day. Then fate intervened in the most mundane way possible. It was a Tuesday morning, I remember, because Tuesday was always my late day at work. My wife had already left, and I'd just dropped the kids off at school. I came home to grab some files I'd forgotten and decided to quickly check email before heading to the office. And there it was. A small, yellow sticky note next to our computer keyboard. In my wife's handwriting, her AOL username and password. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, staring at that piece of paper. It might as well have been a loaded gun sitting on the desk. I knew that once I crossed this line, there would be no pretending, no plausible deniability, no comfortable ignorance to hide behind. But 400 miles per week of lies had already crossed that line for me. My hands were shaking as I logged into her account. The familiar AOL interface loaded, and there it was, her inbox, full of the digital breadcrumbs of her secret life. I didn't have to scroll far. The email exchanges with her college best friend were right there, recent and frequent. And as I read them, my entire world crumbled and crystallized at the same time. Girl, you're glowing lately. This thing with, let's call him Jake, is really agreeing with you. I can't believe how easy this has been. Drop the kids at mom's, meet Jake for lunch, and then, well, you know. Winking face, I feel like I'm in college again. LOL, and what about his wife? Does she suspect anything? Please. She's so busy with her 3 kids and has gotten so fat after having them all. Jake says she barely pays attention to him anymore. Honestly, I'm doing him a favor. I read those words over and over, each time feeling like someone was driving a knife deeper into my chest. But it wasn't just the betrayal, it was the cruelty. The casual way they talked about destroying 2 families. The mockery of this other woman, this complete stranger who was being cheated on just like me. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake. This was calculated, ongoing, and cruel. I printed everything. Every email, every exchange, every casual reference to their affair. My hands were steady now, the shock had burned away, leaving something much more dangerous in its place, clarity. But printing emails wasn't enough. I needed more than digital evidence of an affair. I needed the full picture, and for that, I was going to need professional help. I called my friend Mike, who'd been a cop for 15 years. After I explained the situation, carefully, calmly, like I was reporting a burglary instead of the destruction of my marriage, he gave me a name. Ron Patterson. He left the force about 3 years ago to start his own PI business. He's discreet, thorough, and honest. If there's something to find, he'll find it. Ron's office was in one of those generic business complexes that could house anything from insurance agencies to tax preparers. Nothing about it screamed private investigator, which, I suppose, was the point. Ron himself was exactly what you'd expect from an ex-cop turned PI, mid-50s, graying hair, the kind of steady, unimpressed demeanor that comes from seeing the worst of human nature on a daily basis for decades. He listened to my story without judgment, took notes in a small notebook that looked like it had seen better days, and accepted my retainer with the professionalism of a man who'd handled 1,000 similar cases. Give me 2 weeks, he said as I handed over the printed emails. I'll know everything there is to know about your wife's activities. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I went through the motions of normal life, work, dinner with the family, helping with homework, bedtime stories. But underneath the surface, I was a man preparing for war. And then Ron called. "We need to meet," he said simply. His report was thorough, professional, and devastating. Complete with photographs, timestamps, locations, and a level of detail that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The routine was exactly what I'd suspected, but somehow worse in its banality. My wife would drop our children off at her parents' house, then drive to meet her lover at various restaurants around town. They'd have lunch, casual, public, hiding in plain sight. Then they'd drive to the same dumpy motel on the outskirts of town, register under fake names, and spend 2 to 3 hours in room 237. Room 237. I'll never forget that number. The photographs were clinical and clear. My wife and a man I'd never seen before, walking into that motel together. Timestamps showed they'd been doing this for at least 6 months, probably longer. But Ron had done more than just document the affair. He'd identified the man. His name was Bob Henderson. 38 years old, married for 12 years, father of 3 children aged 7, 9, and 11. He worked as vice president of sales for his father-in-law's manufacturing company, a family business that had been around for 30 years and was quite successful by all accounts. Interesting family dynamic, Ron noted as he walked me through Bob's background. His wife Sarah is the owner's daughter. The house they live in? It's owned by her parents. The car he drives? Company car. His job, his home, his lifestyle, it all flows through his wife's family. I stared at Bob's photo, a corporate headshot from the company website. He looked ordinary. Brown hair, pleasant smile, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting. This unremarkable man had been sleeping with my wife, mocking his own wife, and apparently felt entitled to destroy 2 families for a few hours of afternoon entertainment. "What do you want to do with this information?" Ron asked. I'd been thinking about that question for days. My parents had cheated on each other throughout their marriage, and the constant fighting, the bitter divorces and reconciliations, the way they used their children as weapons, it had poisoned my entire childhood. I'd sworn I would never put my own children through that hell. "I want a divorce," I said. "Clean, quick, and final." "And him?" Ron nodded toward Bob's photo. I looked at that ordinary face again, thinking about those cruel emails, about the casual way my wife and her lover had mocked his wife's appearance after having children, about the complete disregard they'd shown for the collateral damage of their affair. "His wife deserves to know what kind of man she's married to." Ron nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. But you should know, information like this, it tends to have consequences. Sometimes bigger consequences than people expect." "Good," I said, and I meant it. The next phase required precision timing and careful coordination. I met with a divorce attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in cases involving infidelity. She reviewed Ron's report with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen it all before. "This is very thorough," she said, flipping through the photographs and timeline. "More than enough for a clean divorce. When do you want to file?" "I want everything coordinated," I told her. "I want my wife served with papers the same day his wife finds out about the affair." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "That's specific. May I ask why?" "Because I want them to face the consequences of their choices at exactly the same moment. No time to prepare, no time to coordinate their stories, no time to minimize the damage." She nodded approvingly. "I like the way you think." We set the date for a Thursday. My wife would be served at her workplace during her lunch break. Ron would meet with Bob's wife at the same time, showing her everything he'd discovered. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dominoes I was about to push over, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But then I'd remember those emails, the casual cruelty, the way they'd laughed about his wife's weight gain after having 3 children. They'd made their choices. Now they'd live with the consequences. Thursday arrived with deceptive normalcy. I got the kids ready for school, made small talk with my wife over breakfast, kissed her goodbye like I had thousands of times before. Except this time, I knew it would be the last time. At 12:30 p.m., my phone rang. Patricia. It's done. She's been served. At 12:35 p.m., Ron called. Sarah Henderson knows everything. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. My wife called me that evening, sobbing and apologetic, but I'd already made my peace with the end of our marriage. I was calm, civil, and completely unmoved by her tears. We talked logistics, who would stay in the house until everything was sorted, custody arrangements, how to tell the children. I kept it businesslike and brief. But Bob's world? Bob's world exploded. According to the court documents that became public record over the following months, and yes, I followed every filing with the dedication of a scholar, Sarah Henderson had moved with the efficiency of a woman who'd been planning for this possibility her entire marriage. Within hours of meeting with Ron, she'd cleaned out their joint bank accounts. By evening, she'd taken their 3 children and moved back into her parents' house. By the next morning, Bob was fired from the family business and served with an eviction notice for the family home. But Sarah wasn't finished. Bob, apparently, was not a man who accepted consequences gracefully. According to police reports, he showed up at his in-laws' house the following weekend, demanding to see his children and work things out with his wife. The confrontation escalated quickly. Sarah's brother answered the door, a former college football player who didn't appreciate Bob's aggressive tone and increasingly erratic behavior. When Bob pushed his way into the house and started screaming at Sarah in front of their terrified children, her brother intervened. One broken nose later, Bob learned that actions have consequences beyond just losing your job and home. The restraining order was filed on Monday. Bob violated it on Wednesday, showing up at Sarah's workplace and creating such a scene that security called the police. More charges, more court dates, more legal fees that he couldn't afford now that he was unemployed. It became a spiral of increasingly desperate behavior. Each poor decision led to worse circumstances, which led to even poorer decisions. The man who'd been so cavalier about destroying other people's lives couldn't handle the destruction of his own. The final court documents showed a divorce settlement that left Bob with virtually nothing. No assets, no custody, no relationship with his children, and a criminal record that made finding decent employment nearly impossible. I heard through Ron, who maintained certain professional connections, that Bob had left the state entirely within 6 months of the affair being exposed. Just disappeared. No forwarding address, no contact with his children, no attempt to rebuild his life locally. Meanwhile, Sarah Henderson picked up the pieces with remarkable grace. She went to work for her father's company, not in some made-up position, but actually learning the business from the ground up. When her father retired 2 years later, she took over as CEO and grew the company significantly. The last I heard, she'd remarried a widower with 2 children of his own, and their blended family was thriving. As for me? My divorce was finalized 6 months later. My ex-wife and I developed a cordial co-parenting relationship focused entirely on what was best for our children. When they asked about the divorce, we told them simply that sometimes adults grow apart, and it was better for everyone if we lived in separate houses but continued to love them just as much. Now, more than 20 years later, both my children are adults with families of their own. They have healthy relationships with both their parents, and the divorce didn't poison their childhoods the way my parents' constant fighting had poisoned mine. My ex-wife eventually remarried, a decent man who treats her well and has been a good stepfather to our children. I harbor no ill will toward her. We made a mistake in getting married so young, and she made a mistake in having an affair instead of asking for a divorce when she became unhappy. But people make mistakes, and life moves on. Bob, though? Bob made a choice to be cruel. And cruelty, I've learned, has a way of circling back around. Looking back on it all, I don't think what I did was revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't set out to destroy Bob's life, I simply made sure that his wife had the same information I had discovered about my own marriage. What she chose to do with that information was entirely up to her. But there's something to be said for consequences. For 20 years, I've watched my children grow into honest, responsible adults who understand that choices have outcomes. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this, not that revenge is sweet, but that accountability is necessary. So what do you think? Was this justified consequences or calculated revenge? Have you ever been in a situation where someone's betrayal changed the entire course of your life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, smash that like button and subscribe for more tales of life's unexpected turns. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the natural consequences of their own choices. Until next time, keep your secrets better hidden than a sticky note next to the computer.